The billionaire thought she was just a waitress. Then she spoke Arabic like a native. The evening rain drummed against the windows of Belmore's, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. Inside, warm amber lights cast golden shadows across mahogany tables dressed in crisp white linens. The air carried whispers of seared lamb, fresh rosemary, and the subtle perfume of wealth that seemed to follow certain patrons through the door. Among the servers, weaving gracefully between tables, stood Maya Thompson, her uniform pressed to perfection, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun that framed her deep brown face. She moved with a quiet confidence that most customers never noticed, too absorbed in their own conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and weekend trips to the Hamptons. Maya had been working at Belmore's for 3 years now, using every penny from her tips to fund her doctoral studies in Middle Eastern linguistics at Columbia University. But to most patrons, she was invisible, just another face bringing them their overpriced steaks and imported wine. The restaurant door swung open with unusual force that evening, causing several diners to glance up from their plates. Khalid al-Rashid entered like a storm system, bringing with him an atmosphere of undeniable power and presence. His tailored Armani suit probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months. His watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, caught the light with every gesture of his manicured hands. Behind him followed his business partner, Omar Naziri, a man who seemed to exist solely to laugh at Khalid's jokes and nod at his observations. They were shown to table 7, the best spot in the house with a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. Maya watched from the service station as her colleague Jennifer approached them with menus, only to be waved away dismissively by Khalid, who demanded to speak to the manager about getting proper service. The manager, ever eager to please wealthy clientele, quickly redirected Jennifer to another section and assigned Maya to their table. She gathered her composure, picked up her order pad, and walked toward them with the same professional smile she wore like armor. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Belmore's. I'm Maya, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with something to drink?" Her voice was warm, professional, carefully modulated from years of practice. Khalid barely looked up from his phone, rattling off an order for their most expensive bottle of wine without acknowledgement. Omar at least had the courtesy to make eye contact, though his smile held a condescending edge that Maya had seen too many times before. As she wrote down their order, Khalid said something to Omar in Arabic, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who believes they're speaking in secret code. The words were crude, a joke about how these people, and he used a particularly nasty term, always smiled even when they had no idea what was being said around them. He made a comment about her figure, about how American waitresses were trained like circus animals to perform for tips. Omar laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the elegant space. Maya's pen never stopped moving across her pad. Her smile never wavered. But inside, something shifted, like tectonic plates realigning before an earthquake. She closed her order pad with a soft snap that somehow managed to cut through their laughter. Then, in perfectly accented Levantine Arabic, the dialect spoken in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, the one Khalid himself was using, she responded, "Sir, I understand every word you're saying. And while I'm happy to provide excellent service, I'd appreciate if you could maintain the same level of respect for me that I'm showing you. Now, shall I give you a moment to reconsider your wine selection, or would you prefer to continue assuming that education and intelligence are limited to those who look like you?" The words flowed from her lips like honey laced with poison, each syllable pronounced with the kind of precision that only comes from years of intensive study. Khalid's hand froze halfway to his water glass. Omar's mouth fell open, his laughter dying in his throat like a bird hitting a window. The silence that followed was so complete that Maya could hear the soft jazz playing from the restaurant's speakers, could hear the clink of silverware from 3 tables away. Khalid's face went through a series of transformations: shock, embarrassment, anger, and then something else, something Maya couldn't quite identify. You speak Arabic?" Khalid finally managed, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. Maya allowed herself a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I speak 7 languages, actually. Arabic, French, Mandarin, Spanish, Swahili, Portuguese, and English. I'm completing my doctorate in Middle Eastern linguistics at Columbia. I've spent 2 years living in Beirut, 6 months in Cairo, and 3 months in Dubai. I've translated for the United Nations and written papers on the evolution of modern Arabic dialects. But tonight, I'm your waitress. Because, contrary to what you might believe, sometimes brilliant people do whatever it takes to fund their dreams. Now, would you like to hear about our specials? She delivered this information with the same pleasant tone she might use to describe the soup of the day. Omar looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Khalid, however, was staring at her with an intensity that made her wonder if she'd gone too far. His dark eyes searched her face as if seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her, not just the uniform and the role he'd assigned her in his mind. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken tension. Then Khalid did something unexpected. He stood up, his full 6'2" frame unfolding from the chair with surprising grace. For a moment, Maya tensed, unsure of what was coming. But instead of anger or indignation, Khalid placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of genuine respect in Arabic culture. "Miss Maya," he said, and his voice had lost all traces of its earlier mockery. "I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight, but for every assumption I've made about people based on appearances. Please, sit with us for a moment." Maya glanced around the restaurant. The manager was nowhere in sight, and her other tables were settled. Against her better judgment, she pulled out a chair and sat down, maintaining professional posture even as her heart raced. Khalid returned to his seat, his expression thoughtful. "I built my fortune in tech," he began, his accent more pronounced now that he wasn't trying to project American corporate polish. "Started with nothing in Jordan, worked my way through university, came to America with big dreams. I faced discrimination, prejudice, people assuming I was just another Middle Eastern man who got lucky with oil money. And somewhere along the way, I became the very thing I hated. I became someone who judges others by their surface." Omar shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to seeing his friend and business partner in such a vulnerable state. Maya listened, her trained linguist's ear picking up the subtle shifts in Khalid's tone, the way his formal Arabic occasionally slipped into more colloquial Jordanian expressions when emotion crept into his voice. "You remind me of my sister," Khalid continued, surprising Maya with this personal revelation. "Rania. She's a surgeon now, but she worked 3 jobs to put herself through medical school. One of them was at a coffee shop where businessmen would come and practice their English. They'd make jokes about her in Arabic, thinking she was just another foreign student who barely understood English, let alone Arabic. She never told them she was top of her class, that she spoke 4 languages, that she was going to save lives while they pushed papers. She just smiled and served their coffee. Until one day, like you, she'd had enough. She responded to one particularly crude customer in perfect classical Arabic, quoting poetry from the Abbasid period. The man nearly choked on his espresso. Despite herself, Maya found a genuine smile tugging at her lips. The image was too vivid, too familiar. "Your sister sounds like someone I'd like to meet," Maya said, allowing her professional mask to slip just a fraction. Khalid's face lit up with an idea. "She's actually in New York this week. Medical conference at Mount Sinai. I was supposed to have dinner with her tomorrow, but—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Would you join us? I mean, if you're not working. I'd love for her to meet someone who put me in my place so eloquently. She'd never let me hear the end of it, and frankly, I'd deserve it." Maya considered this invitation. Every professional bone in her body said to politely decline, to maintain boundaries. But there was something in Khalid's eyes now, a genuine curiosity, a humbling that seemed real rather than performed. "I have classes until 6 tomorrow," she heard herself saying. "But I could meet you after." The smile that spread across Khalid's face transformed him entirely. Gone was the arrogant billionaire who'd walked in earlier. In his place sat a man who'd been reminded of his own journey, his own struggles, his own humanity. The rest of their meal proceeded with a completely different energy. Khalid insisted on hearing about Maya's research, genuinely fascinated by her work on the preservation of endangered Arabic dialects. He shared stories of his grandmother, who spoke a rural Jordanian dialect that was slowly disappearing as younger generations moved to cities and adopted more standardized Arabic. Omar, initially resistant to the shift in dynamics, gradually warmed up as Maya explained the mathematical patterns in language acquisition, something that appealed to his background in engineering. They discussed the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, debated the linguistic implications of code switching in multilingual societies, and found themselves laughing over shared experiences of cultural mistranslation. When Maya brought their check 2 hours later, Khalid had written something on a business card. "My company is launching an AI translation project," he said, sliding the card across the table. "We need someone who understands not just languages, but the cultures and context behind them. Someone who won't let us make assumptions or take shortcuts. The position pays 3 times what you're making here, with full benefits and flexible hours that would work around your doctoral schedule. But more importantly, you'd be doing work that matters, preserving languages and making real connections possible across cultures." Maya picked up the card, her fingers trembling slightly. The number he'd written as a starting salary made her eyes widen. It was more than enough to finish her doctorate without the constant stress of making rent, enough to actually focus on her research, enough to visit the communities whose languages she was studying. "This isn't charity," Khalid said quickly, apparently reading her expression. "This is me recognizing talent when it's standing right in front of me, serving me a slice of humble pie I desperately needed. My company needs someone like you, someone who sees beyond surface assumptions, who understands that language is about more than words. It's about dignity, respect, and human connection." Maya looked up from the card to meet his eyes. "Can I think about it?" she asked. Khalid nodded. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." As they prepared to leave, Khalid left a tip that made Maya protest, but he waved her off. "Consider it tuition reimbursement," he said with a wry smile. "You just taught me a lesson worth far more than that." The next evening, Maya found herself at a quiet Moroccan restaurant in the East Village, sitting across from Khalid and his sister, Rania. Rania was everything Khalid had described and more: brilliant, funny, and devastatingly quick with her observations. When Khalid told her the story of how they'd met, Rania laughed so hard she nearly cried. "Finally!" she exclaimed in Arabic. "Someone put my brother in his place. Maya, you're my hero." The evening flew by in a blur of a conversation, switching fluidly between Arabic and English, sometimes mid-sentence. Rania shared stories of her own struggles in medical school, the professors who assumed she was there to find a husband rather than save lives, the patients who requested a real doctor when she walked into their rooms. Maya talked about her research, her dream of creating a comprehensive digital archive of endangered Arabic dialects before they disappeared forever. Khalid listened more than he talked, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that showed he'd actually been processing what Maya had said the night before. As the evening wound down, Rania pulled Maya aside while Khalid handled the check. "He hasn't been able to stop talking about you," she said quietly. "Not in a romantic way, though who knows what the future holds, but in a way I haven't seen before. You challenged him, made him think. That's rare for someone in his position. People usually just tell him what he wants to hear." Maya glanced over at Khalid, who was arguing good-naturedly with the waiter about accepting his credit card. "He's different than I expected," she admitted. "After that first impression, I thought—" Rania nodded knowingly. "Success can be poison if you're not careful. It makes you forget where you came from, who you were before the money and power. You reminded him. That's a gift." A week later, Maya submitted her 2 weeks' notice at Belmore's. The manager was shocked, especially when she told him where she was going. Al-Rashid Technologies? The Khalid Al-Rashid? But he was just here last week. Maya smiled. Yes, he was. And sometimes the most important conversations happen when you least expect them. Her last shift at the restaurant was bittersweet. She'd learned so much there, not just about service, but about people, about assumptions, about the ways we see and don't see each other. As she hung up her apron for the last time, she found a note tucked into her locker. It was written in elegant Arabic script. "Thank you for reminding me that respect isn't measured in bank accounts or expensive suits. It's measured in how we treat those who serve us when we think no one is listening. You were listening. You were always listening. And now, I promise, I will listen too. Khalid." 6 months later, Maya stood before a packed conference room at Al Rashid Technologies, presenting the beta version of their revolutionary translation software. It didn't just translate words, it preserved context, cultural nuances, and the subtle poetry that existed in every language. The project had already received interest from UNESCO and several governments working to preserve indigenous languages. Khalid sat in the back of the room, no longer the center of attention, content to watch his team, Maya's team now, explain their work. When someone asked about the inspiration for the project, Maya smiled. "It started with a simple conversation," she said, her eyes finding Khalid's across the room. "A reminder that every person we meet carries entire worlds within them, languages, stories, cultures, dreams. Sometimes we just need to stop assuming and start listening." The presentation was a massive success. But for Maya, the real victory had come months earlier, in that moment at Belmore's when she'd chosen to speak up, to demand recognition not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been dismissed based on appearances. She'd thought she was just correcting one arrogant customer. She'd ended up changing the trajectory of her life, and, perhaps more importantly, reminding a powerful man of his own humanity. Years later, when journalists wrote about Al Rashid Technologies' groundbreaking work in language preservation, they often asked Khalid about the genesis of the project. He would always tell them the same story, though most assumed he was joking or being metaphorical. "The project started because I walked into a restaurant thinking I was better than everyone else," he would say. "I made a cruel joke in Arabic, assuming the waitress couldn't understand. But she could. She understood perfectly. And in that moment of being called out, of being seen for who I really was rather than who I pretended to be, I realized how much we lose when we make assumptions about people based on how they look or what job they're doing. That waitress, Dr. Maya Thompson now, taught me that brilliance doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it serves you dinner while pursuing a doctorate. Sometimes it speaks 7 languages while you're still stumbling through your second. She became my company's head of linguistic development. But more than that, she became the conscience of our work, constantly reminding us that technology should bridge gaps, not widen them. The story became legend within the company, told to every new hire as part of their orientation. It was a reminder that innovation could come from anywhere, that respect should be given to everyone, and that the moment you think you're the smartest person in the room is probably the moment you're about to learn otherwise. Maya never got tired of hearing it, though she'd always add her own postscript when asked. "The truth is," she would say, "I almost didn't speak up that night. I almost just smiled and took their order like I had hundreds of times before. But something made me decide that silence wasn't serving anyone. Not me, not them, not the next person they'd make assumptions about. Speaking up was scary, but staying silent would have been scarier, because every time we let those moments pass, we reinforce the idea that some people matter more than others. And that's a language I refuse to be fluent in." The Belmore's restaurant eventually added a small plaque to Table 7, though most customers never noticed it. It simply read, "At this table, assumptions were challenged, perspectives were changed, and a partnership was born that would go on to preserve over 50 endangered languages worldwide. Remember, everyone has a story. Everyone has a voice. Sometimes we just need to listen." And Khalid? He never forgot the lesson Maya taught him that rainy evening in Manhattan. He implemented company-wide policies ensuring every employee, from janitors to executives, had access to education funding. He started a foundation providing scholarships for service workers pursuing higher education. And he never, ever made assumptions about people based on their appearances again, because he'd learned in the most humbling way possible that the person serving your dinner might just be the one who changes your life. The person you dismiss might be the one you desperately need. And sometimes the most profound education comes not from boardrooms or lecture halls, but from a moment of courage when someone decides to speak their truth, no matter what uniform they're wearing. In the end, the billionaire thought she was just a waitress. Then she spoke Arabic like a native, became more than just a story about a momentary embarrassment or a clever comeback. It became a testament to the power of education, the importance of respect, and the beautiful complexity that exists within every human being. Maya often reflected that if she hadn't spoken up that night, she might still be at Belmore's, still struggling to make ends meet, still keeping her brilliance hidden behind a service smile. And Khalid would still be making cruel jokes in multiple languages, never realizing the opportunities he was missing, the perspectives he was ignoring, the fullness of humanity he was failing to see. Their story spread beyond the company, beyond the industry, becoming a reminder that transformation is possible when we're brave enough to show our true selves and humble enough to recognize we might be wrong. It reminded people that every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce stereotypes or shatter them, to either diminish others or elevate them, to either stay comfortable in our assumptions or grow through uncomfortable truths. The partnership between Maya and Khalid's company continued to flourish, eventually expanding into educational initiatives that brought language preservation technology to schools in underserved communities worldwide. Maya completed her doctorate with distinction, her dissertation on digital preservation of oral language traditions becoming a seminal work in the field. She never forgot her time at Belmore's, though. Sometimes, when meeting with government officials or presenting at international conferences, she would remember the weight of that serving tray, the ache in her feet after a double shift, the careful smile she maintained even when customers treated her as invisible. Those memories kept her grounded, reminded her that dignity isn't determined by job titles or bank accounts, but by how we treat each other in our daily interactions. And Khalid, he kept that note he'd left in Maya's locker, framed now in his office, not as a trophy or a reminder of shame, but as a compass, constantly pointing him toward humility and respect. He often said that losing his arrogance was the best investment he ever made, because it opened his eyes to the brilliance that surrounded him every day, in every person he met, if only he was willing to see it. The ripple effects of that single evening continued for years. Employees at Al Rashid Technologies spoke of a culture unlike any other in the tech industry, where ideas were valued regardless of their source, where the input of a junior developer carried as much weight as that of a senior executive if the idea had merit. The company's translation software became the global standard, not because it was the most technically advanced, though it was, but because it had been built with genuine respect for the communities it served. Every feature, every update, every decision was filtered through what became known as the Maya Principle. The idea that technology should amplify human dignity, not diminish it. Universities began case studies on the company's approach, but Maya always insisted the real lesson was simpler than any business school could teach. See people. Really see them and be willing to be surprised by what you find. Years passed, and the story evolved with each telling, but the core truth remained. A moment of courage in speaking truth to power, a moment of humility in accepting that truth, and the transformative power of genuine respect. Maya went on to author several books, speak at countless conferences, and become a leading voice in linguistic preservation. But she never forgot that it all started with a decision to speak up, to demand better, to refuse to be invisible. And whenever young people asked her for career advice, especially those working in service industries while pursuing their dreams, she would tell them this: your current job doesn't define your worth or your potential, but how you do that job, how you carry yourself, how you treat others and allow yourself to be treated, that defines everything. Don't be afraid to show your brilliance, even if you're wearing an apron. Don't be afraid to demand respect, even if you're serving someone their dinner. Because sometimes the most important moments of our lives happen when we least expect them. When we choose courage over comfort, when we decide that being underestimated is their mistake, not our reality. The story of the billionaire and the waitress became more than just an anecdote. It became a parable for the modern age, A reminder that in a world quick to judge by appearances, the greatest revolutionary act might be simply refusing to play along. It reminded people that every person they meet is carrying stories, languages, dreams, and capabilities that might surprise them, if only they're willing to look beyond the surface. And in conference rooms and classrooms, in restaurants and offices, in places where power dynamics play out every day, people remembered Maya's words in Arabic that night, her calm dignity in the face of disrespect, and found their own courage to speak up, to demand better, to refuse to be invisible. Because that's what real change looks like. Not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but individual moments of courage that ripple outward, changing perspectives, opening minds, and reminding us all that respect isn't something you wear, or buy, or inherit. It's something you give and something you demand, regardless of which side of the service counter you're standing on. The title that had once been just a moment of surprise, the billionaire thought she was just a waitress, then she spoke Arabic like a native, became a rallying cry for anyone who'd ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. It reminded them that their moment would come, their voice would be heard, and their truth would transform not just their own lives, but the lives of those around them, if only they had the courage to speak it.